In pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Sapio podcast, coming to you here from Montecito, California. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something that seems pretty basic, and it is basic, but it's also very complex. It's called the common cold. And the reason I want to talk to you about this, or the reason I was thinking about talking to you about this, was that, well, I've got a cold, if you can hear it in my voice, and it happened after I came back from a cold place. I came back from New York, and it was snowing and cold there. And before that, I was in Europe, and it was cold. And now I have a cold. And so, of course, people think it's because of the cold, and it's not. I'll get back to that in a second. But let's start with a simple question, right? This is a purely, curious question, which is, what is a cold anyway? I mean, we always have them. I mean, the common cold, ultimately, what it is, it's a viral infectious disease that primarily affects the upper respiratory tract. What do we mean by the upper respiratory tract? It basically means all where the air is moving above the lungs. And if it gets into the lungs and stuff, you start calling that a pneumonia, and it can become a much more serious thing. But basically, the upper respiratory tract here, you get your nose and your throat and all that stuff. I'm sure I don't need to remind you that you know what exactly a cold is, but the symptoms include a runny nose that might turn discolored. You have nasal stuffiness. Why do you get nasal stuffiness? Because, well, you get these swollen nasal passages, and they're basically reacting to these virus particles and that kind of thing. You're having immune reactions, right? So it's like an inflammation thing. If you go back to my podcast on inflammaging, you'll know what I'm talking about. But basically, you got these swollen nasal passages. You got a sore throat. You get a cough. Why do you get a cough? Well, that's typically because of this drippage. You get this drippage in the back of your nose, and that's called postnasal drip. And it's literally like dripping mucus onto your vocal cords. And your vocal cords don't like that. And there's a reflexive response, and that is, that's a cough. And of course, there's another reflex, which is a sneeze, right? And the sneeze is basically a reflex that clears the nasal passages of irritants and other kinds of discharge. Some people, luckily not me, also get ear symptoms all the time. This is particularly common in kids, and that's because the nose is connected to the ear via what is known as the eustachian tube. It's basically it literally is a little tube that connects the back of the nose to the ear. And what's interesting about that is you might wonder why in children they get ear infections more common. Actually, it's because the angle of the eustachian tube changes as we get older, makes it much less likely for that mucus to flow into the ear as we get older. And so that's why for most adults, ear infections are not as big of an issue as they are for children. Anyway, that's something you probably didn't know, but yeah, it's true. The eustachian tube angle affects our whether or not you get an ear infection or not. But one thing's was certain, it really does suck having a cold. But they usually do resolve themselves in about 7 to 10 days. They peak at about day 3. I'm at about day 3 right now, so I'm not liking it. But if symptoms last longer than that, accompanied by fevers, maybe with some shortness of breath, you might have something else, like a bacterial infection, for example, or you might be getting something more serious, and you might need to seek medical attention if that's the case. And by the way, none of this is medical advice. Even though I am a physician, I know there's plenty of non-physicians out there that are happy to give you medical advice, but I don't want to give you advice. Anything here is purely informational stuff, right? Anyway, does a cold, going back to that question of the cold and me coming back from Europe and from New York with a cold, have anything to do with cold weather? Well, as it turns out, the term cold itself comes from historical context. We through centuries, people have believed that the cold was actually caused by cold weather. You go outside and your mom will say, hey, put on a jacket, you don't want to get you a chill and get sick and all that stuff, right? And if you go back to ancient Greece, there's references in the writings of Hippocrates that talk about the various respiratory ailments that were more common in the winter. And so, as it turns out, the cold is not caused by the cold, though, right? The cold is caused by various viruses. Now, it's true that colds happen more frequently when the weather is cold, but that's most likely associated with other stuff that happens in the winter. For example, people spend more time indoors when it's cold. And when they spend more time indoors, they're in closer proximity to others, breathing the same air. And there's some evidence that exposure to cold weather can even temporarily weaken your immune system and make you more susceptible to these viral infections as well. So the cold is caused by viruses, not the cold itself, bottom line. So that's one important point to remember if you've ever wondered that. As it turns out, the common cold is mostly caused by two types of viruses. One is a rhinovirus, and you don't need to know much more than that. It's a rhinovirus, it's a cold. The other is coronaviruses. Now, I know you're thinking, coronavirus, you mean like COVID-19? As it turns out, coronaviruses existed and still will exist before the sickness we know as COVID-19 ever came about. Think of coronaviruses as simply a species of viruses, and they're some more dangerous to humans than others. And until COVID, coronaviruses were primarily known for causing the cold. In fact, I remember in medical school, and this is a while ago. This is a while ago, maybe 20 years ago or so. Has it been that long? Okay, maybe not. Yeah, about 20 years ago. I remember memorizing the causes of the common cold. All right, and as I mentioned, they were the rhinovirus and the coronavirus, the most common causes. And the way I remember memorizing that by visualizing an elephant with a cold drinking a Corona beer. Anyway, so now you'll never forget that. You'll never forget that. There's one little bit of image in your head emblazoned with a common cold. It's an elephant with a cold drinking a beer. Now, how do you get a cold then? Well, typically there's direct contact, like hand-to-hand contact. It's probably the most common, right? Then you touch your own nose or your eye, and then it gets into this whole system of yours, because the eye is also connected to the nose as well, through some other tubes and such. We won't get into that though. There's also airborne spread, inhaling droplets from infected people. And that's why it's good for them to cover their nose, mouth when they cough or sneeze. So along that lines, to prevent the cold, the best thing you could do is to wash your hands frequently with soap, hand sanitizers, and avoid contact with sick people. And you can also try to get some ventilation inside your house if it's cold outside, and try to figure out how that to happen. But try to get some air that is fresh and free of virus. Now, again, it's a little bit harder to do in the winter and all that, but it is a strategy. The problem is that anyone, particularly with children, knows that it's virtually impossible to avoid getting a cold. I know where I got mine. I got mine from my 8-year-old who was with me before I even, left for any of these trips. And then she went to New York with me. She had a bad cold the week before I got mine. And as a single dad, it's hard to avoid contact with your own little petri dishes. My 8-year-old, I can't not have contact with her, nor can I resist having contact with her. But I did manage to quarantine her from my other two daughters. I guess in the process, I jumped on the grenade myself. So now I have a cold. What can I do about it? Well, as you probably know, there's no cure for the common cold. And in fact, there's no vaccine. And that seems crazy, right? After all, there's even medication for COVID now, and that's a coronavirus. And that medication, by the way, if you're curious, is Paxlovid. It's certainly, I think it's certainly worth it if you get COVID. And people are still, they're not dying really, but people still get pretty sick from some of these COVID strains. So if you do get COVID, keep Paxlovid in mind. It certainly seems to help a lot. But for the common cure, you're kind of out of luck. There's no cure. And why is that? Well, as it turns out, there's so much genetic diversity in viruses that cause the common cold that it's almost impossible to target anything. In other words, if you think about the COVID vaccine, the way they did that is they targeted something called the shock protein. So there was something that was pretty specific to COVID-19, and they created a vaccine based on that. But the problem with the common cold is these things they're just moving targets for one thing, and then there's hundreds of them, right? There's slightly different species. So it becomes very, very challenging to come up with any kind of medication per se, or vaccine or anything like that for the common cold. Again, they mutate so quickly, as well as having so many strains that it's a big challenge. So what do you do? How do you manage a cold? Well, for one, you can treat symptoms with cold medicine. One thing that I think is very helpful that a lot of people don't do is nasal saline irrigations, and just trying to that helps when you have like nasal congestion. And doing so, you can kind of dilute out the virus that's in the nasal area. So that's certainly something to think about. Nasal saline irrigations, you can go get these little bottles, and you get neti pots or whatever like that. And that is something that I would recommend. There are also some studies showing that there are a few things that you can do to shorten the length of your cold. One of them is zinc supplements, particularly in the form of lozenges or syrup. They've been shown to actually reduce the duration of cold symptoms, particularly if taken within 24 hours of the onset of symptoms. So I do that. In particular, I use this one that I found very helpful, Zicam. Although in this particular situation, I don't think I got to it within 24 hours, which might have created a problem for me. There's vitamin C. Vitamin C can certainly has been known to prevent the cold, but also been shown to slightly reduce duration and severity of cold symptoms. Echinacea is the similar type thing. And now people are talking a lot about probiotics. Not only, I guess, a preventative measure because it's thought to, potentially boost the immune system, but potentially can also reduce the duration of the common cold. That's an area that, a lot of people talk about. What I would say is it's not harmful, and it's certainly something that could help. But there's still a lot of evidence that's still emerging in this area, so I can't really say anything definitively. Finally, what about chicken soup? Was your mother right in saying that it could help with your cold? Well, there actually is some scientific evidence to support this. And while it's not a cure, chicken soup can provide symptomatic relief and may have mild anti-inflammatory effects to help alleviate those cold symptoms. And if nothing else, you will feel taken care of. But for the most part, again, with a cold, it's all about, overcoming it is about rest, hydration, if you can do some saline, anything you could do to dilute this darn virus. And that's about it. Anyway, given that I have a cold and I don't have much voice left, that's it for this episode of Sapio with Buck Joffrey. Hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully you're staying healthy yourself. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe. Until next time, this is Buck Joffrey for Sapio with Buck Joffrey.